Something is happening inside the technology industry right now that the mainstream conversation has not fully caught up with. Yet quietly, steadily, in numbers that are growing every quarter, people are leaving Windows. Not the kind of people who were always going to leave. Not Linux enthusiasts who had been waiting for an excuse. Ordinary people, teachers, small business owners, retirees, parents, writers, people who had been using Windows their entire computing lives, who had never thought of themselves as someone who would or could use a different operating system, who are now running Linux and describing the experience as the best computing decision they ever made. This is not a niche story anymore, and understanding why it is happening is understanding something important about where personal computing is going and what Microsoft has done to accelerate a departure it should have worked harder to prevent. The short version is this. Microsoft has spent the last several years making Windows worse for the people who use it while making it better for Microsoft's revenue streams. Every major design decision in Windows 11, from the hardware requirements that excluded hundreds of millions of functioning machines, to the aggressive integration of Copilot, to the advertising inside the Start menu, to the telemetry that cannot be fully turned off, to the terms of service that now include AI training as a potential use of your content, has been made in the interest of Microsoft's business rather than the interest of the person sitting in front of the keyboard. People notice. Maybe not immediately, maybe not consciously, but the accumulation of small frustrations, of feeling managed rather than served, of watching a machine you paid for do things you did not ask it to do, for reasons that have nothing to do with you, eventually crosses a threshold. And for a growing number of people, that threshold is where Linux begins. Let us start at the beginning with the decision that accelerated this exodus more than any other: Windows 11's hardware requirements. When Microsoft announced that Windows 11 would require a trusted platform module chip and specific processor generations, it declared hundreds of millions of computers officially incompatible. Machines that ran Windows 10 perfectly well, machines that had years of productive life remaining, machines that users had no reason to replace from a performance perspective. Microsoft framed the requirements as security improvements, as the foundation for a safer computing experience. Security researchers and technology journalists examined those claims and found them considerably overstated. The TPM requirement provided incremental security benefits, not the transformative protection Microsoft's marketing implied. The primary effect of the requirements was not a safer Windows, it was a narrower one. For users whose machines were excluded, the situation was clarifying. Microsoft had taken a functioning computer and told them it was no longer worthy of the latest operating system. Windows 10 would stop receiving security updates in October 2025. The implied message was clear: buy a new computer. Specifically, buy a new computer with the hardware Microsoft now required, most of which came from manufacturers who had commercial relationships with Microsoft and paid for the Windows licenses that shipped on those machines. The business logic of the hardware requirements was more legible than the security logic. The users who went looking for an alternative and found Linux for the first time because of this situation discovered something unexpected. Their excluded machine, the one Microsoft had declared too old for Windows 11, ran Linux faster than it had ever run Windows, not marginally faster. Noticeably, significantly, immediately faster. Boot times that had stretched to a minute and a half on Windows completed in 15 seconds on Linux. Applications that had become sluggish opened instantly. The fan ran less. The battery lasted longer. The machine that Microsoft had implicitly told them to throw away turned out to have years of performance remaining that Windows had been consuming through background processes, telemetry services, and an operating system designed to do far more than display a desktop and run applications. This discovery, repeated by millions of users over the past several years, is the foundation of the current Linux moment. Not ideology, not politics, not a philosophical commitment to open source software. Performance. The tangible daily experience of a computer that works for you instead of against you. But performance is only the first layer of why people are staying on Linux once they try it. The second layer is what they find when they look at what Windows was actually doing in the background that they did not know about. Windows 11 collects behavioral data about how you use your computer. This is documented in Microsoft's own privacy policy and in the technical specifications Microsoft publishes for its telemetry system. Device identifiers, application usage patterns, feature interaction data, error reports that include information about what was in memory when an error occurred, search, queries made through the Windows search bar, location data, the contents of the Start menu, suggestions that reflect what Microsoft's systems believe you are interested in based on your behavior. This data flows to Microsoft's servers continuously in the background from every Windows 11 installation. Even at the most restrictive settings available to home users, the floor of this collection is not zero. There is no setting in Windows 11 that stops Microsoft from receiving behavioral data from your computer. There are settings that reduce what is collected. There is no setting that stops it. Microsoft's terms of service, updated in recent years, now explicitly include the use of content you provide to improve Microsoft products and services, including AI systems. Content you provide includes documents created in Microsoft 365, email sent through Outlook, files stored in OneDrive, and searches performed through Bing and Windows Search. The productivity tools that hundreds of millions of people use for their most sensitive professional and personal work are, according to Microsoft's own terms, potential training data for AI systems that Microsoft develops and commercializes. The free tier of Microsoft's ecosystem is free because you are contributing your content and your behavioral data to a commercial operation. Even the paid tiers of Microsoft 365 include this data collection because the commercial value of the behavioral data is not just in replacing subscription revenue, but in building AI products that will generate new revenue streams. When people who left Windows for Linux performance reasons discover this data collection situation, their decision to stay on Linux becomes easier. Linux does not collect behavioral data about how you use your computer. There is no telemetry system sending your application usage patterns to a corporation. There is no advertising identifier connecting your behavior across applications. There are no terms of service that include your documents as potential AI training data, because there is no company in the relationship with a commercial interest in your content. The operating system is maintained by a community. It runs on your computer. It does what you tell it to do. That is the entirety of the relationship. The third layer of why people are staying is the discovery of what modern Linux distributions actually look and feel like. Because the reputation of Linux as something difficult, technical, and hostile to ordinary users is decades out of date, and it keeps the people who would benefit most from switching from ever trying. Linux Mint, which is consistently recommended as the best starting point for users coming from Windows, looks like a computer, not like a science project, not like a terminal window full of commands. A desktop with a taskbar at the bottom, a start menu style button on the left, a system tray on the right, a file manager, a web browser, and a software center where you can find and install applications with a single click. The interface was designed by people who understood that the single biggest barrier to Linux adoption was the assumption that it would require relearning how to use a computer. Linux Mint requires no such relearning. You turn it on, it looks familiar, you use it. Installation takes approximately 20 minutes from start to a working desktop. The installer asks a small number of clear questions in plain language. It detects your hardware and configures drivers automatically. It gives you the option to install alongside Windows, which means your existing Windows installation remains untouched, and you choose which system to start when you turn on your computer. This dual boot setup is the safest and most recommended path for first-time Linux users because it requires zero commitment. You try Linux. You use it for a week or two. You decide whether it works for your needs. If it does not, you boot back into Windows and nothing has changed. If it does, you gradually spend more time in Linux until you realize you have not booted into Windows in 3 weeks and do not miss it. The software situation on Linux is better than the reputation suggests. Firefox and Chrome both have Linux versions. Warwick's LibreOffice handles Microsoft Office documents with compatibility that covers the vast majority of everyday use cases. VLC plays every media format that exists. Spotify, Discord, Zoom, Slack, and many other mainstream applications have official Linux versions. The applications that do not have Linux versions, primarily Adobe's Creative Suite and certain enterprise software, are real limitations for the specific users who depend on them. But for the majority of computer users whose needs consist of browsing, email, writing, video calls, and media consumption, Linux covers everything without compromise. Gaming on Linux has undergone a transformation in the past 3 years that has brought a new category of user into the Linux community. Valve, the company behind Steam, built its Steam Deck gaming device on a Linux-based operating system, and in doing so invested heavily in making Windows games run on Linux. The result is Proton, a compatibility layer that allows the majority of Steam's library to run on Linux. The Steam Deck plays modern, demanding games on modest hardware running Linux. On a full desktop or a laptop with dedicated graphics, hardware running Linux, the game compatibility is even better. Users who monitor their gaming on Linux consistently report that the majority of their library works well, that performance is comparable to Windows for most titles, and that the gap between Linux gaming and Windows gaming has narrowed to the point where it is no longer a compelling reason to stay on Windows for the majority of gamers. The regulatory environment around Microsoft's data practices is also shifting in ways that are making the case for alternatives more urgent. The European Data Protection Board has been examining Microsoft 365 deployments across public sector organizations in European Union member states. The German government's Data Protection Authority has issued guidance to public institutions about data flows created by Microsoft products. The Dutch privacy watchdog conducted a data protection impact assessment of Microsoft 365 and identified multiple compliance concerns. Several European governments and institutions have initiated or completed migrations away from Microsoft products toward open source alternatives, specifically in response to data protection concerns. These are not individual users making personal choices. These are government bodies with legal authority making institutional policy decisions based on documented findings about what Microsoft's products do with data. For individual users in any jurisdiction, the implication is the same one that drove these institutional decisions. The operating system and productivity software that most of the world uses by default has been designed by a company whose financial interests are served by it. Collecting behavioral data from its users, who has updated its terms to explicitly include AI training as a potential use of user content, and who has made privacy controls available that address a portion of its collection while leaving other mechanisms operating regardless of user settings. That is the documented reality. The alternative, Linux plus privacy-respecting productivity tools, offers a fundamentally different relationship with the software you use every day. Making the switch is a process, not a single event. The first step is downloading Linux Mint from linuxmint.com. The second is creating a bootable USB drive using a free tool called Rufus on Windows or Balena Etcher on any platform. The third is booting from that USB drive and spending an hour in the live environment, using Linux Mint on your actual hardware without installing anything or changing anything about your existing setup. The fourth, if the live environment feels workable, is running the installer and choosing to install alongside Windows. The fifth is using Linux as your primary system for 2 weeks while keeping Windows as a fallback. The sixth, for most people who get to the fifth step, is realizing they have not needed the fallback. The migration of data is easier than most people expect. Linux Mint can read your Windows files directly from the Windows partition. Your documents, photos, and other files do not need to be converted or transferred. LibreOffice opens your Word and Excel files. Your browser bookmarks and passwords import in under a minute. Your email, if you use a web-based email service, works identically in Firefox on Linux as it did in any browser on Windows. The people leaving Microsoft are not leaving because they hate technology or because they have become privacy extremists. They are leaving because Microsoft has made a series of decisions that prioritized the company's commercial interests over the experience of the people using the product. Hardware requirements that excluded functioning machines. Telemetry that cannot be fully turned off. Terms that include user content as potential AI training data. Advertising inside the operating system interface. Forced integration of AI features that consume hardware resources for Microsoft's purposes. Each of these individually is a frustration. Together, they constitute a relationship with your operating system that feels adversarial rather than collaborative. Linux offers a different relationship. The operating system runs on your computer. It does what you ask. It does not send your behavior to anyone. It does not train AI on your documents. It does not push you toward commercial products or services. It does not require specific hardware to justify its continued existence on your machine. It simply works faster and more quietly than what it replaced on hardware that Microsoft declared obsolete for people who decided they were done being a resource in someone else's commercial operation. The exodus from Microsoft is not a trend that will reverse. The conditions that created it, the hardware exclusions, the telemetry, the AI terms, the advertising, are features of Microsoft's business model, not bugs that will be corrected. They will persist and likely expand as Microsoft's AI ambitions grow. The people who have already switched know something that the people still on Windows are about to discover. The alternative is not a compromise, it is better. And the process of finding that out is easier than you think. Let me go deeper on something that gets mentioned in passing in most conversations about this topic, but deserves its own careful examination. The psychological experience of switching. Because the technical barriers to switching from Windows to Linux have genuinely fallen to the point where they are manageable for most users. The barrier that remains for most people is not technical, it is psychological. It is the accumulated weight of familiarity, the feeling that Windows is how computers work, that the start menu and the taskbar and the way applications are installed through executable files is not a design choice that one company made, but is instead the natural order of computing that any alternative must deviate from at the user's expense. This feeling is understandable. Most Windows users have been using Windows since they first touched a computer. The interface is not just familiar, it is the template against which everything else is measured. When they imagine switching to Linux, they imagine learning a foreign language, relearning how to do things they already know how to do, starting over from zero competence in an environment that does not accommodate inexperience. The reality of modern Linux distributions, particularly Linux Mint, dismantles this feeling almost immediately. The taskbar is at the bottom of the screen. There's a button in the lower left corner that opens a menu of applications organized into categories. You click on an application to open it. You right-click on files to see options. You drag files between folders. You type in a browser address bar to navigate to websites. You maximize and minimize windows using buttons in the upper right corner of each window. Every single one of these interactions is identical to Windows. The interface was not designed to be different. It was designed to be familiar, specifically because the people who built it understood that familiarity is not a trivial concern for someone making a major change to their computing environment. The week after switching is the period when the psychological adjustment happens. The muscle memory that reaches for the Windows key and expects a specific menu gets redirected. The habit of clicking in one place finds the equivalent in a slightly different location. These small adjustments take days, not weeks. Users who have made the switch consistently report that by the end of the first week, the new environment feels natural. By the end of the second week, they stop noticing the difference. By the end of the first month, they find themselves reaching for their Linux habits when they occasionally have to use a Windows machine and feeling the friction of that system rather than the one they left behind. This adjustment curve is not unique to Linux. It is the universal experience of anyone who switches between any two sufficiently similar environments. It feels steep before you start, and it turns out to be manageable once you are in it. The anticipation of difficulty is consistently worse than the difficulty itself. The support ecosystem around Linux Mint specifically is another factor that the reputation of Linux does not accurately reflect. The Linux Mint forums are active, well organized, and populated by users at every level of experience, including many who are recent converts from Windows and who understand the specific questions that Windows users ask. The documentation for Linux Mint is written in plain language. Searching online for any problem you encounter returns results quickly because Linux Mint has been in use by enough people for long enough that almost every common issue has been encountered, documented, and solved in a publicly accessible format. The experience of running into a problem and being able to find the solution in under 5 minutes of searching is routine rather than exceptional. The hardware compatibility situation in 2026 is also substantially better than the historical reputation of Linux suggests. Wireless networking adapters, which were a consistent source of driver difficulties in earlier years, are now supported out of the box for the vast majority of common hardware. Printers, which remain the most frequent source of setup difficulty, have manufacturer support for most models, or community-developed drivers that work reliably. Graphics cards from both major manufacturers have good Linux support, with open source drivers that work well for everyday use and official manufacturer drivers available for users who need maximum gaming performance. The cases where Linux genuinely cannot support a piece of hardware, where the limitation is real and unavoidable rather than a matter of finding the right driver, are increasingly rare and are concentrated in very new hardware, where driver development is still catching up. The community of people who have made the switch is also worth acknowledging as a resource that does not exist in the same form for any proprietary operating system. Linux users who switched from Windows have a shared experience and a shared identity that creates genuine enthusiasm for helping newcomers navigate the same transition they made. The question asked by a new Linux user in a forum, a subreddit, or a chat community reliably receives multiple helpful, patient responses from people who remember asking the same question themselves. This is not universal in every corner of the Linux community, but it is the dominant experience in the communities built around distributions designed for new users. There's also the question of what switching costs you in terms of the things you were doing on Windows that you need to continue doing on Linux. This is the most important practical question for anyone considering the switch, and it deserves an honest answer rather than an enthusiastic dismissal of the concern. For users whose computing consists of web browsing, email, writing documents, making video calls, streaming media, and managing photos, switching to Linux costs you nothing functionally. Every one of these tasks has a solution on Linux that is equal to or better than its Windows equivalent. The browser is the same browser. The video call platform works the same way. The document application opens the same files. The streaming services work the same way in the browser. The photo management application is different but capable. The transition for these users is primarily about familiarity and muscle memory, which both resolve within a few weeks. For users whose computing includes specialized professional software, the calculus is more specific. Adobe Creative Cloud applications do not have Linux versions. If your work depends specifically on Photoshop, Illustrator, Premiere Pro, or other Adobe applications, Linux does not replace Windows without compromise. GIMP is a capable image editing alternative for many use cases. DaVinci Resolve, which has an official Linux version, is a professional video editing application that rivals Premiere Pro for many workflows. But Adobe's tools are what they are, and their absence on Linux is a real limitation for users whose professional identity and workflow efficiency is built around them. For gamers, The situation has improved dramatically and continues to improve. The majority of Steam's library runs on Linux through Proton. Most games that do not have anti-cheat systems that specifically block Linux work without significant configuration. The games that remain problematic are primarily those with aggressive Windows-only anti-cheat implementations, which is a real limitation for competitive multiplayer gaming in specific titles. Single-player gaming, older titles, and games without anti-cheat run well. The gaming situation on Linux is good enough today that it is not a reason to avoid switching for most gamers, and is only a firm obstacle for users who depend on specific problematic titles. The decision to switch from Windows to Linux is ultimately a calculation about your specific situation, what you need your computer to do, what Microsoft has become in its relationship with the people who use its products, what you're willing to invest in adjustment and learning, and what you stand to gain from an operating system that works for you without a parallel commercial agenda running in the background. The people leaving Microsoft are making that calculation and arriving at the same answer in growing numbers. They are finding that the investment is smaller than they expected, that the adjustment is faster than they feared, and that what they gain in performance, in privacy, in the simple satisfaction of a computer that does what they tell it without doing anything else is worth every minute of the transition. Windows will not disappear. Microsoft will not collapse. But the relationship between Microsoft and its users has changed in ways that are driving a meaningful and growing portion of those users to look elsewhere. Linux is where most of them are looking. And what they are finding when they look is not what the reputation prepared them for. It is better, simpler, faster, more honest about what it is and what it asks of the person using it. That is the story of why people are switching. And for anyone reading this who has been considering it, that story could be yours too.